So an important note before we get into talking about all these different mental disorders is to not go around diagnosing yourself or others. Only licensed professionals can make a diagnosis. You don't want to start thinking about people as having disorders that they don't necessarily have. People, especially medical students and students of psychology, can also start to think that they have every single illness that they're reading about or that they're studying. And I want to tell you guys that's normal to think, oh my gosh, this fits me. Do I have this? But don't just go around diagnosing yourself. If it's not diagnosed by a professional, it's not necessarily an accurate diagnosis. If you or someone you know is having mental health issues, I want to encourage you guys to reach out. Student counseling services is still in effect. They're doing telehealth now. So you can basically Zoom with a counselor. It'll be kind of like your Zoom classes, except one-on-one and confidential. So feel free to reach out to them if you need help. Contact the doctor in your area. Everywhere in Virginia, there's a community service board for your area. So in our area, we have the New River Valley Community Service Board. However, I know some of you guys have gone back home, so you might have a different CSB wherever you're at. Emergencies in this area, the number is 540-961-8400. That's also the crisis hotline number you can see in the bottom right. And I actually volunteer there, but since the pandemic has us social distancing, I will not be taking your call. So don't feel like afraid to call because you think I'll be the one to answer. I'm not currently going in because of the pandemic, so feel free to call that number. And then I have just some other business numbers here that you guys can use. I have the suicide prevention hotline number, and this is really helpful. Even if you are doing great, you probably have a friend that is struggling right now, especially with all the isolated feelings everyone is experiencing and changing to online classes and all sorts of stressors that are not typical. So if you feel like someone is struggling, you might want to give them some of these resources. You can find a therapist in your area if you need. A lot of therapists are doing telehealth now. So they'll talk to you either on the phone or on Zoom or some other video chat. And then I have these hotlines here. So RAFT is the one in Radford and Blacksburg area. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline is on the right there. And then a couple other numbers that you can use. The last one is actually a crisis text line, which I think people like. Sometimes they feel more comfortable texting and not talking on the phone. At least that's what I've been told, that young people do not like talking on the phone. So that's one thing to consider. Okay, so now that I got that spiel out of the way to make sure you guys have those resources, let's talk about what abnormality actually is. So when we talk about psychological disorders, they fall under the heading of abnormal psychology. Can also be called psychopathology. An abnormal psychology implies that something needs to be abnormal, but what does that actually mean? So abnormal is generally defined as the opposite of normal. But what is normal? That's subjective as well. So there are subjective views as to what we think is normal behavior versus abnormal behavior, normal feelings versus abnormal feelings, and these can partially depend on societal norms. I think that one issue people are having now is experiencing a spike in anxiety due to the coronavirus. And I've noticed people feel unsure if they have an anxiety disorder or if this is just a normal response to what's happening in the world. That would be an example of trying to figure out what is normal versus, okay, at what point is this an abnormal level of anxiety? When we diagnose someone with a psychological disorder, we have to make sure that it's actually meeting some standards of abnormality. And one easy way to remember this is thinking of these 4 Ds. Deviance means not in line with normal standards. So behavior or feelings or cognitions that are not the societal norm. If you're experiencing a very extreme level of anxiety, that might be deviance from the norm. So it's not just a passing worry. The second D is distress. So for something to be a psychological disorder, in most cases, it has to cause distress. There are some exceptions. The vast majority of disorders have to, by definition, cause distress. So distress is upsetting, it causes pain, suffering, and or sorrow. The third D is dysfunction, and this is the disruption to one's regular routine or an interference with day-to-day functioning. So if you are functioning just fine with your worries, that might not indicate dysfunction. Whereas someone that's having, for example, I just keep using anxiety as an example because I think it's easy to think about. So if someone is having panic attacks, they can't go to class, they're so anxious they can't even leave the house or make it to appointments, that would be a great example of dysfunction. And then finally, the fourth example is the fourth D, is danger. So this might lead to harm or injury to self or others. And in most cases, people with psychological disorders do not harm others. They certainly harm themselves more often statistically than harming anyone else, but there is sometimes a risk of harm to self and others. So that is the fourth D to look for here. So these will come back in our definition of psychological disorder. So what is a psychological disorder? These are patterns of deviant and dysfunctional behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that cause significant distress and may even be dangerous. So you can see those four Ds come back. And for it to be a psychological disorder, it needs to be consistent over time. So if I have a panic attack once and then it never happens again, that is not going to be meeting the criteria for a psychological disorder. There needs to be some consistency over time. Professionals use different criteria to diagnose these psychological disorders, and at some points they have to use their best clinical judgment. So some things are somewhat subjective, but at what point is something dysfunctional? At what point is something deviant from the norm? So in that case, professionals use their best clinical judgment to make diagnoses. We do have labels and diagnoses for mental disorders, and they are useful for many reasons, but there can also be some problems and issues with labeling. So pros of using diagnoses and using labels is that it gives someone an explanation for the abnormality. So it can literally give us language to talk about a disorder. If I am a therapist and I have a bunch of clients that are all experiencing these same symptoms of depression, they're all experiencing fatigue, sadness, a lack of motivation, etc., etc. It's helpful if I have a common term that I can use to describe these people rather than just having to list out all of these different symptoms over and over again. So having a quick term, a common language between professionals so that when you say major depressive disorder, the other person knows what you're talking about. Having diagnoses can also help people track the rates of different disorders and also the utilization of mental health services. So if we have a label for a disorder, we can track how many people in the US have that disorder, have been diagnosed with that disorder, how many have it now, how many have ever had it in their lifetime, so the prevalence of that disorder in our society, and then how often those people are utilizing different mental health services. And finally, diagnoses are important because they help people get insurance coverage. So if you want to bill insurance when you are treating a client, you'll need to sometimes have a diagnosis there. There are, however, problems and issues. Formal or informal labels can cause maybe prejudiced ideas and attitudes about different disorders. So informal labels like crazy can be negative, and then formal labels can even have a lot of negative stereotypes associated with them. Borderline personality disorder is one example of a mental disorder that has a lot of negative stigma. Giving something a label can sometimes allow it to be used as an excuse. Um, so for some people, they might find it an issue where they say, oh, that's just my depression, so I'm actually just going to lay in bed today. So at some point, using it as an excuse could be an issue. It could create a self-fulfilling prophecy where someone believes that they can't do something or they can't get better because they have a diagnosis. Again, there can be stigma, and these labels and diagnoses can be persistent. So even if maybe there is something you were diagnosed with as a child, maybe it wasn't an accurate description, or maybe you did meet that criteria, but you no longer do, that can actually stick with you. And that can stay in your medical records, and that can carry with you over time. It can be a problem when therapists look at previous therapists' notes and don't remember to keep in mind that this might not be accurate. So what I mean by that is almost a sense of laziness of saying, oh, this person has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. If the therapist isn't aware that that might not be accurate, or that that might be an inaccurate diagnosis, then that can cause them to make an inaccurate diagnosis themselves and to treat this person in a sort of bias, to almost assume that they have that disorder. So they can be very persistent. Do you guys have any questions? I feel like I went through that rather quickly, so I just want to check in. Okay. Oops. All right. So mental disorders and diagnoses can carry stigma, and this is that disapproval, the poor treatment or discrimination or isolation due to being different. So again, one example that we'll talk about later, probably not today, is borderline personality disorder. This is a psychological disorder that carries a lot of stigma. Schizophrenia carries a lot of stigma. A lot of people have negative ideas associated with that. There's also a commonly held belief that people that have mental illnesses are dangerous, even though the vast majority of those that suffer from psychological disorders do not harm others. Usually they're more likely to harm themselves, if anyone. And the stigma can lead to internalized feelings of shame, which might further that cycle of the disorder and make it more difficult to get better. So as a little class activity, on your phone or whatever is near you, I'm not going to collect this, so you can write it on whatever you want. Write down the 5 biggest parts of your identity. So I gave just an example for myself. I wrote graduate student, counselor, friend, teacher, music lover. So really, really quick on your phone or whatever is convenient, just write down what comes to mind as the 5 biggest parts of your identity. And I'll just give you a minute to do that. So it might be sister, brother, girlfriend, whatever comes to your mind. Okay. So if you guys have a list either written down, or if you're good at remembering, maybe you have 5 items in your mind, I want you to think about what is the most important one out of the 5 to you. So which one is the most important to you? Okay. So you don't need to share what yours was, but I just want to do this with you as a thought exercise for an example of why it is important um, not to make someone only their disorder. So if you picked whatever your top thing was, is that the only thing you would want to be known as? And I'm guessing probably not. So if I picked graduate student, is that the only part of my identity I would want to be known as? No, probably not. So whatever you picked, I'm assuming that's not your entire identity. You're multifaceted. There's a lot of different aspects that make up who you are. And the same is true for those with mental disorders. So the reason I'm doing this thought experiment with you guys is to help you understand why we use something that's called person first language. So person first language is basically putting the person literally first before the mental disorder. So instead of saying something like an anorexic, you would say a person with anorexia. So instead of saying that they are their disorder, you are instead acknowledging them as a person and then acknowledging that they struggle with a mental disorder. So here is just some examples of person first language. So you probably don't say the crippled, but that would be one example of something that wouldn't be person first language. Instead, a person with a disability. Some other offensive terms you wouldn't want to use. Instead, a person with an intellectual, cognitive, or developmental disability. Instead of the blind, a person who is blind. Instead of crippled or lame, a person with a physical disability, physically disabled. And probably most relevant to this lecture, instead of crazy or psycho, we say a person with a mental health issue or a person who suffers from whatever that disorder might be. So I think this comes up with certain disorders more than others. Um, Sometimes people refer to narcissists as like a narc, or people with borderline personality disorder as a borderline. So just keep in mind that that is not that person's entire identity. Sorry, that is not that person's entire identity, and you should put the person first before the disorder. Okay. So before we get into talking about different disorders, we should talk about how we classify mental disorders. And we use oftentimes what's called the DSM. And the DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The current version, the current edition, is the DSM5. It's gone through many different iterations. The newest, most relevant one in the picture is the purpley blue DSM5 on the right. The DSM is a classification system, and it's used to make consistent and objective decisions about defining, diagnosing, and treating abnormal behaviors. So before the existence of the DSM, we didn't have an organized way to describe all these different symptoms as one unitary construct. So like I was saying before, different symptoms of depression like fatigue, sadness, maybe suicidal thoughts, lack of motivation. Those might all fall under the same diagnosis, but there wasn't one objective classification system before the DSM. So the first version was created in the 50s, and it was pretty psychodynamic. It was based in Freud's theory. So it was much less sophisticated than our current DSM, much more psychodynamic based on those unconscious drives, Freud's work on hysteria. Then the second version came around and it became more about different personality disturbances. So people started to look at how individual differences play in. Then the third version, the DSM-3, that's that green book there, was the first book, the first DSM to use explicit criteria and definitions for mental disorders. So explicit criteria means that in order to diagnose a specific disorder, an individual has to meet some certain set of criteria in order to be diagnosed. There was also a revised version of that DSM, that's the DSM-3R, that blue one there. Then the fourth version, it split mental disorders into categories and introduced the idea of clinical significance. And clinical significance, again, is saying that for this to be a disorder, it has to have an actual impact, an actual negative impact on the person's functioning, and it has to be deviant from the norm. So the DSM-4 was also revised. That's that gray book on the bottom, the DSM-4 TR. And then finally, they revised that DSM-4 and created the DSM-5 that came out in 2013. And it has 541 mental disorders. It divides them up into 19 categories. And it's interesting, they arranged this one using a lifespan approach. So they actually arranged the book in order from left to right, from things that would occur in childhood, that are more biological that you're born with, to at the end, things that would come up towards the end of life. So that DSM-5 is the current version. I have a copy. If we were together in class, I'd pass it around for you guys. So that is the most current version. I will note that the DSM is not the only classification system. So there are some other systems, including the ICD-10, but we're only talking about the DSM in this class, and that is what a lot of psychologists are familiar with. Okay. So again, this is the current version. It's this purplish book, the 5th edition, and it's used to define disorders, to diagnose them, and for case formulation. So trying to figure out, okay, does this person meet the criteria to have this diagnosis, and what's going on there? So it's a quick way to sum up a client's case. They also have specific codes and specifiers. The codes can be used to bill clients' insurance, and then the specifiers can help make a more specific and accurate diagnosis. So, for example, ADHD might have an inattentive type or a hyperactive and impulsive type. So those would be an example of a more specific diagnosis using those specifiers. And the DSM is also used for data collection purposes and billing purposes. So when we talk about whether something is clinically significant enough to warrant a diagnosis, we have to look at the level of distress and impairment it's actually having on an individual. So here you can see there's kind of a sliding scale from normal to abnormal levels of distress and impairment. And again, if you picture perhaps, I think anxiety about the coronavirus is a really relevant example. So some anxiety, worrying about the virus, worrying about getting sick, worrying about your friends getting sick, that might be closer to that normal end of the scale. That's something that a lot of people are worried about right now. That's societally normal to be worried about. You're not deviating from the norm there. And perhaps it's not causing you that much distress. You're still able to get your schoolwork done. It's just a little bit more difficult. Whereas if you are exceedingly worried, you're having panic attacks, you are unable to make this shift to online classes, you're worried all the time, you feel like you have no control, that would be an example of someone more towards the right of that distress impairment scale. So when we're looking at clinical significance, the level of distress and impairment in a person's life is going to be crucial. And again, for most psychological disorders, it actually has to have an effect on their distress and ability to function in their lives properly. So I'm not going to test you on this list, so don't memorize this list. But these are all those different categories of disorders in the DSM-5. So it starts out with the neurodevelopmental disorders. Those are more biologically based. So things like ADHD and different learning disabilities that start out in childhood tend to be more biologically based. You're born with that. It moves to schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. So we'll mainly talk about schizophrenia in this class. Then the next section is bipolar and related disorders. We'll talk about bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Then we move to depressive disorders, anxiety disorders. We'll cover some of those. Then OCD now has its own section, and related disorders, trauma and stressor related disorders. So we'll talk about PTSD, that would fall under that section. Dissociative disorders. If you guys have ever heard of multiple personality disorder, that's now called dissociative identity disorder. That falls under the dissociative disorders category. Somatic symptom and related disorders. I don't think we're going to talk about any of those in this class. Feeding and eating disorders, we'll cover those. Elimination disorders, we're not going to talk about those. Sleep-wake disorders, sexual dysfunctions. There's actually a lot of different sexual dysfunctions that are pretty interesting that the DSM covers, but we're not going to talk about those in this class just because we don't have time. Gender dysphoria, disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders, substance-related and addictive disorders, neurocognitive disorders, personality disorders, which we will definitely talk about, and then paraphilic disorders. So there's 19 different categories. We're not going to go through all of them, and we're probably going to only talk about the most prominent ones in each of the categories that we will cover. So the ones that I want you guys to know about in this class tend to be probably more relevant. They're going to be things that you've heard of and that you might know people who struggle with. I think that might be a good place to stop for today before we get into the different criteria, and then we can pick it up on Thursday and start getting into the different disorders.